From some of the most famous leaks in history to declassified missions that changed the course of it, these leaked classified Pentagon documents will leave you speechless. Starting off this list, we have the Pentagon Papers. Perhaps the most famous Pentagon leak in history, former President Lyndon B. Johnson is said to have kept many secrets and lies about the Vietnam War hidden away until a military analyst leaked the records and exposed the truth back in 1971, right in the New York Times. The Pentagon Papers were a very secret Department of Defense study, and the papers, when leaked, told everyone about the extent of America's political and military involvement in the Vietnam War. President Johnson certainly was not the only president named in the papers, as other names included Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy, who is said to have been extremely misleading about the United States' direct involvement in the way. The release of these papers really only fueled people in their protests against the war, and it also was one of the moments where the public lost a lot of trust that they once had in the government. Moving on, we have the Discord leak. I'm sure many of us have heard about the recent Pentagon leak that happened all over a Discord server, and this is just one of the documents that was a part of this leak. A classified US military document suggested that there were 97 Special Forces personnel from NATO countries that were active in Ukraine during February and March of this year. Of course, there is a reason why this information was classified, so while it may seem like a trivial thing to leak, the implications could be severe. The media reported that the document, which was dated March 23, 2023, said that more than half of the 97 Special Forces deployed were from the United Kingdom. Despite this leak, however, Britain's Ministry of Defense explained that these allegations should all be taken just at face value. The document also doesn't state when these personnel were there, if they were still there, or what they were even there to do. So at this point, much is still very unclear, which is probably for the best. Coming up next, we have Project Minaret. This is a document that became declassified in 2013 as a part of the National Security Archives efforts. This historical document describes a sort of watch list of prominent Americans who were critical of the Vietnam War. The document explains that their overseas communications were tapped into and listened to by the government from 1967 to 1973, and a quote from the document reads, "President Johnson wanted to know if the domestic anti-war movement was receiving help from abroad." The project expanded so much that it went on to include more than 1,600 people, including civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Whitney Young, and Muhammad Ali. There were also people like Democratic U.S. Senator Frank Church of Idaho, Republican Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, and Washington Post humor columnist Art Buchwald. The surveillance began under President Johnson, but it continued on through to the Nixon administration. In the end, the only reason it was stopped was because Attorney General Elliot Richardson was concerned about its very doubtful and murky legality, and decided during the Watergate scandal that it would probably be best to shut it down. I mean, they definitely had enough on their plate already at the time. Coming up next, we have the Afghan War Diary. The Afghan War Diary was a set of classified documents related to the war in Afghanistan that was leaked by WikiLeaks in 2010. The documents, which were mostly military field reports, provided a detailed and often bleak picture of the war effort, including reports of civilian casualties by US and coalition forces. The documents covered the period from 2004 to 2010 and provided a very unique and unfiltered view of the conflict. Some of the most damning revelations included reports of US and coalition forces killing civilians in mistaken or reckless acts, as well as instances of Afghan forces working with the Taliban. The release of the Afghan War Diary sparked controversy and led to calls for greater transparency in US military operations. Some critics argued that the leak put US and coalition forces at risk, while others praised it for providing important information about the war. Coming up next, we have the Shadow Brokers. The Shadow Brokers leaks were a series of classified documents and hacking tools that were allegedly stolen from the US National Security Agency and released by an unknown group calling themselves the Shadow Brokers. These leaks began in 2016 and continued into 2017 and included information about NSA surveillance programs and other very sensitive activities. Some of the tools released by the Shadow Brokers were reportedly used in cyber attacks, including the WannaCry ransomware attack that affected computers in over 150 countries. The leaks caused significant concern among U.S. intelligence officials and raised questions about the vulnerability of the United States cyber infrastructure. While the identity of the shadow brokers remains unknown, some experts believe that they may have been a Russian hacking group attempting to undermine U.S. security. The shadow brokers leaks were a significant breach of U.S. national security and underscored the growing importance of cybersecurity in modern warfare. Coming up next, we have Operation LAC. Operation LAC, which is short for Large Area Coverage, was a Cold War era project that involved the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Basically, it was a test that was designed to see whether or not it could be possible or feasible to taint a large area by dropping chemical agents from planes. To test this idea, they dropped, quote, a myriad of microscopic particles from planes covering an area that is said to span from the Rockies to the Atlantic, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. So yes, definitely a large area. In fact, it was so large that this is actually the largest test that the Chemical Corps had ever undertaken. According to the declassified documents relating to this operation, the tests, quote, did not provide the Corps with nearly as much data as the Corps would like. And then it goes on to say that, quote, to obtain additional data, the Corps planned further tests for the next fiscal year. Okay, it's a little daunting. While not necessarily the same operation, also in the Cold War era was a similar test conducted that targeted a neighborhood in St. Louis, Missouri. The test saw the area being sprayed with zinc cadmium sulfide. At the time, those local to the area were being told that, quote, the government was testing a smoke screen that could shield St. Louis from aerial observation in case the Russians attacked. But of course, decades later, documents revealed that the tests were actually a part of a biological weapons program. And to make matters even worse, the zinc cadmium sulfide was linked to an increase in cancer among the residents of the neighborhood. Moving on to our next leak, we have the Serbia Leak. According to another recently leaked Pentagon document that is said to have been dated March 2nd of this year, Serbia had agreed to arm Ukraine. The document discusses the European response to Ukraine's request for military training, as well as, quote, lethal aid or weapons, and it shows that they agreed to send over assistance and may have already sent them. The document was labeled no foreign, which means that it was not meant to be distributed to foreign intelligence agencies and militaries, so it's clear that they definitely never expected it to be leaked in a way that the entire world would see. The document also includes information on Serbia declining to provide any training to Ukrainian forces. In response to this leak, however, Serbia's defense minister put aside any reports that they had agreed to supply any arms or that they had already sent them. He actually called the documents, quote, untrue, and said, quote, Serbia did not, nor will it be selling weapons to the Ukrainian nor the Russian side, nor to countries surrounding that conflict. Serbia is definitely in a precarious situation of relying on Russia for energy while also maintaining the desire to join the EU. Coming up next, we have Starfish Prime. This is an operation that took place in 1962, with the documents discussing the outcomes becoming declassified in 1989, and the operation was a joint one between the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and the Defense Atomic Support Agency. Basically, they detonated a thermonuclear device in the sky above the Pacific Ocean. They launched it from the Johnson Atoll using a Thor rocket, and once at an altitude of about 240 miles, they set it off, which ended up producing a yield of about 1.4 megatons. The documents show that the electromagnetic pulse was so powerful and widespread that it disabled not only most of the equipment that was set up to measure it, but it also took out streetlights and caused telephone outages in Hawaii, nearly 900 miles away. The electrons released caused an aura that could be seen over most of the Pacific Ocean, and according to the documents, the, quote, visible phenomena due to the burst were widespread and quite intense, and apparently it was visible for days. In the end, it is said that the researchers weren't expecting such a powerful blast of electromagnetic pulse, and they also weren't anticipating that the electrons from the blast would get stuck in the Earth's own magnetic field for months, possibly even years, but alas, they did. This went on to create a radiation belt around the planet that eventually went on to disable at least 6 satellites, so That's great. Coming up next, we have the Bin Laden Papers. The Bin Laden Papers were a collection of documents and digital files recovered from the compound in Pakistan where al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden was killed by US forces in 2011. Some of these documents were later leaked to the press, providing insight into the workings of al-Qaeda and bin Laden's thinking on various issues. The documents included letters between bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders, as well as documents related to the planning and execution of attacks. The documents also provided a glimpse into bin Laden's personal life, including his concerns about his health and his relationships with his wives and children. The release of the Bin Laden Papers provided a valuable intelligence trove for US officials, and it helped to shed light on the inner workings of al-Qaeda. The papers also underscored the importance of collecting and analyzing intelligence in the fight against extremist groups. Coming up next, we have the embassy missions. This is a secret that was hidden from not only the American people, but also the people that were being spied on and listened to, but it wasn't revealed until 2007 when a document was leaked. This document is one that named 38 different embassies and missions that were so-called targets of US surveillance. The document didn't quite make it clear whether or not these targets were being looked into by only the NSA or if the CIA and FBI were also involved. The document described certain things like bugging fax machines and devices that allowed them to listen in on conversations, and the document also listed the names of different programs that are used within the embassies. The document showed that the embassies targeted weren't just those of countries who seemed to be enemies with the United States, and instead included places like India and Mexico, Greece and Turkey. It appears as if the goal was to gain insider information into the diplomatic relations between the targets and the United States. The EU embassy in Washington, D.C. was one of the targets on this document, and this leak had the potential to have jeopardized one of the largest attempted free trade agreements in the world, because shortly after this all came out, negotiations were set to begin between the EU and the United States. The French president at the time made his anger about the situation very public and stated that all future negotiations will only be made under the agreement that the United States sees all unauthorized surveillance of any EU buildings or personnel. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again soon. Bye!